My father has a habit of saying important things at the worst possible moments, usually while he's got his hands full of something else, like he needs the distraction to get the words out at all. He was loading a cooler into the back of his truck, sweating through his shirt in the August heat, when he stopped, looked at me over the tailgate, and said the thing that would end up rearranging my whole understanding of our family. "Promise me you'll read everything before deciding who failed who." I didn't know what he meant, not really. I said, "Read what, Dad?" And he just shook his head and went back to the cooler like he hadn't spoken at all. That was 3 years after I decided quietly and permanently that I didn't like Diane Foster Bennett. 3 years after I'd built a case against her in my head so complete I could have argued it in court. I was an English teacher. I was good with narratives. I was good at deciding early which character was which. I was wrong about almost all of it. This is the story of how long it took me to find that out and what it cost everyone involved, including me. I want to start 3 years before that afternoon with the cooler, because that's where the story actually begins, not with a single betrayal, but with a long accumulation of small, forgettable moments that I filed away like evidence. My father married Diane 18 months after my mother, Elaine, died. I didn't think that was too soon at the time, not out loud anyway. Grief doesn't move on anyone else's schedule, and I told myself I understood that. What I actually felt underneath the understanding was something closer to betrayal, the sense that my father had rushed toward comfort while the rest of us were still standing in the wreckage of losing my mother. I didn't say that either. I was 23, newly married myself, teaching sophomores how to find symbolism in books they hadn't read, and I had already decided that the correct, mature response to my father's remarriage was gracious acceptance. I performed that acceptance beautifully. I just didn't feel it. Diane, for her part, tried. I'll give her that much credit now, looking back, though it took me years to give it to her honestly. She showed up to that first family barbecue with a peach cobbler and a nervous, hopeful smile, wearing a sundress that was probably too young for her and too formal for a backyard full of citronella candles and paper plates. My husband Cole liked her immediately, which annoyed me in a way I couldn't quite justify. Cole is a firefighter, and firefighters, I've learned, tend to have an instinct for who's actually in danger in a room and who's performing danger. He thought Diane was harmless. Sweet, even, awkward in a way he found endearing. I thought she was trying too hard. That's the whole problem with those early months, if I'm honest. Nothing Diane did was wrong exactly. It was the effort itself that irritated me, the way she'd laugh a beat too long at my father's jokes, the way she asked me about my classroom with a kind of eager, overbright interest that felt to me like an audition. I was the daughter. I didn't think I should have to grade her performance. I just wanted, I think, for someone to acknowledge that a woman named Elaine had lived in this family for 26 years and had a face and a laugh and a specific way of humming while she cooked, and that none of that got to just quietly disappear because a nice woman brought a cobbler to a barbecue. Nobody said that out loud, least of all me. That first Christmas was worse. Diane hadn't yet learned any of our rituals, the order we opened presents in, the fact that my father always burned the first batch of cinnamon rolls and we all pretended not to notice, the specific joke about the crooked angel on the tree that had been crooked since I was 11 and putting it straight was, by unspoken family law, forbidden. She straightened the angel. I watched her do it, watched my father not say anything, and felt something in my chest go cold and hard in a way that had nothing to do with a Christmas ornament, and everything to do with the fact that my mother wasn't there to have an opinion about it. I made a comment, small, sharp enough that Diane's smile flickered, but not so sharp that anyone could call it rude. "We usually leave that one crooked," I said. "It's kind of our thing." And I fixed it myself while she stood there holding a plate of cookies she'd made from what I later learned, though not until much later, was my mother's own recipe box. Because my father, without thinking it through, had handed it to her the week before, thinking he was doing something generous. She didn't say anything. She just put the cookies down and went to help Liam, my 6-year-old, open a puzzle. That was the pattern for the next several months. Family birthday dinners where Diane would say something slightly off, misremember a story, laugh at the wrong moment, mention a plan my father had apparently forgot to tell anyone about, and I would file it away. A hunting trip disagreement where she second-guessed my father's plans in front of Cole and me, not maliciously, just carelessly, the way anyone new to a family might, not yet understanding which topics were sacred. I remember thinking, watching her, she doesn't know anything about us. I didn't ask myself why that mattered so much to me. I didn't ask myself whether it was her job to know or ours to teach her or nobody's fault at all. There were dozens of these moments. None of them alone would sound like much if you described them to a stranger. A comment about the wrong side dish. An offhand remark that revealed she didn't know my mother's birthday. A missed invitation that Diane later said she'd never received, which I privately doubted, because why would my father forget to invite his own wife to something? Small sarcastic remarks, mine mostly, delivered with the kind of plausible deniability I'd perfected as a teenager and never quite grown out of. I was good at cutting someone without leaving a mark anyone else could see. I told myself this made me clever. It made me cruel. I didn't know that yet. My father tried, in his limited way, to smooth things over. Russ Bennett has never in his life said a direct sentence about his feelings if an indirect one would do. He spent 30 years as a county highway engineer, solving problems that have clear, physical answers: how much load a bridge can bear, how to grade a road so water doesn't pool on it. People are not roads. He never learned how to grade the load either of the women in his life were carrying, and so he did what he always did. He smiled, changed the subject, suggested we all just relax and have a good time. It never worked. It just meant the tension had nowhere to go, so it went underground into the space between sentences, into the moments after everyone left. That's where I found her, one evening after a birthday dinner that had gone about as well as all the others, meaning, on the surface, fine. I'd gone back inside for my purse and found Diane in the kitchen alone, drying a dish that was already dry, crying quietly in that careful, contained way people cry when they don't want to be heard. She didn't see me. I stood in the doorway for maybe 4 seconds, long enough to understand exactly what I was looking at, and then I turned around and left without a word. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself she was probably just emotional, the way some people are. I told myself a lot of things that let me walk out of that kitchen and not think about it again for months. I ignored it. That was the choice, not a dramatic one. Just a small, quiet decision to keep believing what I already believed because it was easier than finding out I might be wrong. Nothing exploded that second year. That's the part people don't understand when I try to explain it later. There was no single fight anyone could point to, no scene dramatic enough to become a family legend. It was just erosion. Months of it. The kind of slow structural damage my father would have recognized instantly if it had been happening to a bridge instead of a family, and completely failed to notice because it was happening to us instead. Diane started forgetting things, small things, at first the kind anyone forgets. She'd mention a plan that had apparently been changed and nobody had told her. She'd show up to something at the wrong time or the wrong day and get flustered trying to explain herself. Texts got crossed. An invitation to Liam's school thing got lost, Diane said, though I assumed at the time she just hadn't wanted to come. There were passive-aggressive comments, some hers, most mine, delivered in that same deniable register I'd been perfecting since Christmas. I'd ask Diane a question about my mother's old routines in a tone that made clear I didn't expect her to know the answer, and then act wounded when she didn't. My father kept trying to keep the peace and kept somehow making it worse. He had this specific tell: when things got tense at a family gathering, he'd start talking louder and faster about something completely unrelated, usually a project at work. Some drainage issue on County Road 9, as if enough words about culverts could paper over whatever had just happened between his wife and his daughter. It never worked. It just meant nobody ever actually said the thing that needed saying, and the unsaid thing sat in the room with us at every gathering after, getting heavier. The moment that should have told me something was wrong, really wrong, not just new wife doesn't fit in yet, wrong, came on a Tuesday in March. I'd stopped by my father's house to drop off a casserole dish I'd borrowed, and Liam wanted to look through the hall closet where Dad kept old boxes, hunting for a toy he swore he'd left there. I was digging through a box of winter coats when I found them. 3 wrapped gifts, tags still on, addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize. To Liam from Grandma Diane. One was dated for his birthday, one for Christmas. One had no occasion listed at all, just his name. They'd never been given to him. I found my father in the garage and held them up, more confused than angry at first. These were in the hall closet, I said. Did you know about these? He looked at them for a long moment, and something in his face did a slow collapse, like watching a building settle after the demolition charges have already gone off somewhere out of sight. They were in my truck, he said. I forgot. I meant to bring them in. I just forgot. Diane had bought her step-grandson 3 gifts across the better part of a year, and my father had simply failed to deliver them, and never told her and never told me, and she had presumably spent that year wondering why a 6-year-old never mentioned the presents she'd picked out for him, why nobody thanked her, why her efforts kept landing in silence. I thought about all those birthday dinners. I thought about Diane's face when Liam opened gifts from everyone else and nothing from her, and how I'd privately noted that as one more piece of evidence. See, she doesn't even try when the truth was the opposite. She had tried. My father had just lost the evidence of it in the bed of his truck under a tarp for months. I didn't apologize to her. I want to be honest about that because this whole story is about the gap between what I should have done and what I actually did, and that gap is the story. I gave the presents to Liam myself, told him Grandma Diane picked them out, and let it go at that. I didn't call Diane. I didn't ask her how it felt to buy gifts for a child who never said thank you. I filed it instead under misunderstanding, closed the folder, and moved on. It was around this time that my father said something to me I didn't understand until much later. We were alone, waiting for the others to arrive at some family dinner or another, and he was staring at nothing in particular, the way he does when he's somewhere else in his head. Diane wasn't like this when we met, he said, quietly. Not really to me. More like he was testing the sentence out loud to see if it was true. Like what? I asked. He didn't answer. He just shook his head, the way he always did when a conversation got close to something he didn't want to touch, and started talking about the weather instead. I didn't push. I told myself it wasn't my business, the same phrase I'd used in that kitchen doorway, the same permission slip I kept writing myself to stay uninvolved. What I didn't understand yet was that wasn't like this, wasn't a complaint about Diane's personality. It was the first crack in a wall my father had been building around something he was too frightened to name, even to himself. Our neighbor Bonnie Reeves noticed something before I did, though I didn't think much of it at the time. Bonnie had retired from the Postal Service the year before and had taken up permanent residence, in the way retired people sometimes do, on her own front porch, watching the street with the patient, unhurried attention of someone who has finally stopped being in a rush. She wasn't a gossip. I want to be fair to her, because it would be easy to make her sound like one of those neighbors who exists purely to feed a story its ominous foreshadowing. She wasn't like that. She just noticed things, the way people who have spent 30 years memorizing which house gets which mail tend to notice patterns. Your dad's wife walked past my house 3 times last Tuesday, she told me once when I stopped by to pick up a package she'd signed for. Same direction each time, didn't wave, didn't seem to see me at all. She said it without any particular alarm in her voice, more like she was passing along a weather report. I figured she was just out for exercise. Of course, most people out for exercise notice when a woman's standing on her own porch. I filed that away, too, the same place I filed everything else under odd but explainable. I told myself Diane had probably been distracted, thinking about something, the way anyone can walk past a familiar face without registering it. I didn't ask my father about it. I didn't ask Diane. I had gotten so practiced by then at not asking questions that I sometimes think the not asking had become its own kind of instinct, a reflex faster than curiosity. Liam noticed things too, in the unfiltered way 6-year-olds notice everything and say most of it out loud. Grandma Diane called me Evan today, he told me one afternoon, entirely without weight, the way children report facts that adults will later recognize as devastating. I told her my name was Liam and she got kind of quiet. I remember the small, cold drop in my stomach when he said it, not because I understood what it meant, not yet, since I still didn't know Evan's name existed at all, but because something about the specificity of it, a name instead of a general slip, felt different from forgetting where she'd left her keys. I asked Liam what happened after that. He shrugged, the universal gesture of a child who has already moved on to a more interesting subject, and said, "She said sorry and gave me a cookie." 6-year-olds forgive fast. I was not, at that point in my life, nearly as good at it. By the third year, the changes in Diane were harder to explain away as personality or forgetfulness, though we all kept trying anyway because the alternative was too big to look at directly. She started repeating herself, not the comfortable repetition of a favorite story told at every holiday, the kind every family has, but something with a different texture to it. The same question asked twice within 10 minutes, no memory of having asked it the first time. She misplaced things constantly. Her keys, her glasses, once memorably her own purse, which she accused, gently but seriously, of having been moved by someone in the house, though no one had touched it. She'd bring up old insults. A comment I'd made 2 Christmases before about the crooked angel, for instance, resurrected suddenly and with startling clarity as though it had happened yesterday, while apparently forgetting entirely that she'd apologized to me, or that I'd apologized to her for something else just a week prior. She complained once about bugs crawling on the kitchen counter. There were no bugs. 5 minutes later, she was laughing at something on television as if nothing had happened at all, the complaint gone from her mind as completely as if it had never existed. None of us knew what we were looking at. I want to be precise about that because it would be easy, telling this story backward, to make it sound like the signs were obvious and we were simply too selfish or distracted to see them. They weren't obvious. They looked from the outside exactly like what I'd already decided Diane was. A slightly difficult, slightly self-involved woman who complained too much and remembered grudges too well and couldn't quite keep her story straight. Every symptom fit neatly into the character I'd already written for her. That was the cruelest part, in retrospect. My prejudice against her had built a container that everything, even the earliest signs of something seriously wrong, could be poured into without raising an alarm. It was around this time that Cole convinced me, mostly through gentle persistence rather than any real argument, to see a therapist, not for Diane, not for my father, but for myself, because I'd started snapping at Liam over nothing and crying in the car in parking lots for reasons I couldn't name. I went. I did not enjoy it. Dr. Grant Holly's had an office that smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet, and a way of never quite answering anything I asked him, which infuriated me for the first 2 sessions and only slowly, grudgingly, began to make sense after that. "Why do you think the ornament bothered you so much?" he asked me once after I'd told him the story of that first Christmas, the crooked angel, the sharp little comment I'd made about it. I told him it wasn't about the ornament. He nodded and said nothing and let the silence sit there until I filled it myself, the way I eventually understood he wanted me to. "It was the only thing left that was still exactly how she left it," I said, finally, surprising myself. Everything else in that house had already changed. New curtains, new dishes, my mother's chair was gone. That angel was the last thing nobody had touched, and then somebody touched it. He didn't tell me I was right, he never told me anything. He just asked, "And when you fixed it, crooked again, who were you doing that for, your mother or you?" I didn't have an answer that day. I sat with the question the way you sit with a stone in your shoe, uncomfortable and unresolved, all the way home. It would be months before I understood that I'd been trying to keep my mother present in a house that had, quite reasonably, moved on without asking my permission, and that Diane had never once been the one erasing her. I had simply needed someone to blame for the fact that erosion happens to everyone eventually, whether we fix an angel or not. Cole was the one who said it first. We were driving home from a dinner where Diane had asked Cole, twice, in the space of 20 minutes, how long he'd been a firefighter. A fact she'd known and referenced comfortably a dozen times before, and then, later the same night, had gotten unaccountably upset about a joke my father made, one she'd laughed at the first time he told it years earlier. "Marin," Cole said, eyes on the road, "maybe she's sick." I remember the particular quality of my anger at that sentence. It wasn't cold, considered disagreement. It was a flash, immediate and defensive, the kind of anger that tells you a nerve's been hit somewhere you didn't know was exposed. "She's not sick," I said. She does this, she's dramatic, she always has been." I was furious with him for suggesting it, and it took me a long time, long after that car ride, to understand why. If Diane was sick, then everything I'd built against her, every small cutting comment, every unspoken judgment, every time I'd let her cry alone in a kitchen and told myself it wasn't my business, all of it became something much worse than petty family friction. It became cruelty towards someone who couldn't help what was happening to her. I wasn't ready to be that person. So I refused the diagnosis instead, the way you might refuse a phone call carrying news you already suspect. My father wasn't ready either, though his unreadiness looked different from mine. Mine was denial dressed as loyalty to a grudge. His was denial dressed as loyalty to a promise he'd made twice now and was terrified of breaking again. I saw him cry for the first time in my life that spring. Not at a funeral, he hadn't cried at my mother's funeral, not where anyone could see anyway, but at his own kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday, Diane already asleep upstairs, the two of us sitting across from each other with cold coffee neither of us was drinking. I don't even remember what led up to it. Some small thing. A question I'd asked about Diane's doctor's appointment, maybe, or a comment about how tired he looked. He just put his face in his hands and his shoulders started shaking, silently at first, and I sat there completely unprepared, because in 26 years I had never once seen this man's composure crack, and I didn't know what to do with my hands, my face, any part of myself while it happened. "I don't know what's happening to her," he finally said. "I don't know what's happening to me." I didn't have an answer for him. I just reached across the table and put my hand over his, and we sat there while the coffee got colder, and neither of us said anything else, because neither of us yet had the words for what we were both starting, separately, to be afraid of. I told Dr. Hollies about that night at my next session, expecting him to have some insight ready for me, some framework to hang the evening on. Instead, he asked, "What did you want to say to him sitting there that you didn't say?" I thought about it for a long time. I wanted to ask him if he was scared it was happening again, I admitted. Like with my mom, I wanted to ask if he thought this was his fault too, but I didn't because I was scared of what he'd say. "Which answer were you more afraid of?" Dr. Hollies asked, yes or no. I didn't answer him that day either. I've thought about that question more times since than almost anything else anyone has ever asked me, and I still don't have a clean answer. I think some part of me wanted it to be his fault, because a fault is a thing you can eventually forgive. What I was actually afraid of was that it wasn't anyone's fault at all, that some things simply happen to people you love, regardless of how carefully you watch them, and there is no lesson in that, no warning sign you can promise yourself you'll catch next time. That kind of powerlessness scared me more than blame ever could. The phone rang late on a Thursday night, the kind of hour that already tells you something before you've picked up. Cole was asleep. Liam was asleep. I answered in the dark hallway outside our bedroom, and my father's voice came through sounding like something had finally given way inside him. He told me he was exhausted. Not tired, exhausted, in a way that went past sleep and into something structural, the kind of exhaustion you can't fix with a weekend off. He told me retirement terrified him, because retirement meant time, and time meant nothing to distract him from watching his wife change in front of him a little more each week. He told me he'd thought about divorce, not because he'd stopped loving Diane, he was careful to make that clear, his voice cracking on the word love in a way I'd never heard from him before, but because some cowardly, self-protective part of him thought that leaving now, while there was still a before version of things to remember her by, might be easier than staying for whatever came next. "I can't do it though," he said. "I can't leave her, you know why I can't leave her." I didn't, not yet, not fully. I said his name, gently, the way you'd talk someone down from a ledge you didn't understand the height of. And then he told me the thing he'd apparently been carrying, silent and unexamined, for longer than I had been alive in any meaningful adult sense of the word. "I couldn't save Elaine," he said. My mother's name in his mouth at that hour landed like something breaking. I didn't even see it happening. She was drowning right in front of me for years, and I thought she was just tired. I thought it was just being a mom, just getting older, I didn't ask the right questions, Marin. I never asked the right questions. And then she was gone, and I spent every day since wondering what I would have seen if I just once looked at her the way I look at a road that's about to wash out. I know how to see when something's about to fail. I just never learned how to see it in a person. There was a long silence on the line. I didn't fill it. I don't think I could have, even if I tried. "I can't fail another wife," he said finally. "I can't, even if it kills me. I have to see this one all the way through, whatever it is. I owe that to somebody, I don't even know who anymore. Elaine, maybe Diane, myself, I don't know." I sat down on the hallway floor, phone pressed to my ear, and understood, for the first time, that my father's inability to say a direct sentence about his feelings wasn't emotional laziness. The flaw I'd quietly assigned him for years. It was armor built around a wound so old and so deep that the only way he'd found to survive it was to never look at it straight on. He had spent 3 decades avoiding conflict, not because conflict frightened him in the ordinary way it frightens most conflict-avoidant people, but because looking closely at someone he loved had once meant, in his mind, failing to see the thing that killed her. Avoidance had become his form of safety. It had also, without his ever intending it, become the exact behavior that let Diane's own crisis go unnamed for as long as it had. Because a man terrified of looking too closely at the people he loved is a man poorly equipped to notice when one of them starts, slowly and quietly, to come apart. I told him I loved him. I told him none of it was his fault, my mother's depression, Diane's illness, whatever this new unnamed thing turned out to be. I don't know if he believed me. I'm not sure I fully believed myself, not that night. The next morning he called again, and it was as if the previous conversation had never happened. His voice was bright, deliberately so, the highway engineer voice, all logistics and forward motion. He asked about Liam's soccer schedule. He mentioned a work thing. When I gently brought up the night before, he denied most of it, not aggressively, just smoothly, the way people do when they've decided a truth was too heavy to have said out loud, and are trying, gently, to put it back in the box. In the background, I could hear Diane's voice, cheerful, asking him something about breakfast, utterly unaware of the conversation that had taken place in that same kitchen 12 hours earlier. I hung up feeling like I'd witnessed something I wasn't supposed to see twice, once when it happened, and once when it was unhappened the very next day. I didn't tell Cole everything that had been said that night, not at first. Some of it felt too private to hand over even to my own husband, as if repeating it might wear down whatever fragile thing had let my father say it in the first place. But I told him enough, and Cole, who has spent his career walking into burning buildings and has a professional's calm relationship with fear, said something that stayed with me longer than almost anything else in this whole story. People don't fall apart all at once, he said. Buildings don't either. There's always a slow failure first, someplace nobody's looking. By the time you see the crack in the ceiling, the real damage already happened somewhere underneath, a long time before. He wasn't talking about Diane, not directly. He was talking about my father and about me, and I think, if I'm honest, about himself too, the version of him that had disagreed with me 100 times over the previous 3 years without ever once winning an argument, because I hadn't been in any state to lose one. I went to see Dr. Holly's one more time before the garage, before any of what came next. It was the last of his 3 appearances in this story, and it was the shortest. I told him about the phone call, about the letter I didn't yet know existed but somehow sensed, in a way I couldn't explain, was out there somewhere in my father's past, waiting. "What are you preparing yourself for?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. "Something. I feel like there's something coming that I'm not going to be able to unknow once I see it." He didn't tell me to brace myself or reassure me that it would be fine or offer any of the comforting nonsense I half expected. He just said, "Then when it comes, try to remember that you get to choose what you do with it. Knowing a hard thing isn't the same as being ruined by it. It's just the beginning of a different kind of choice." I didn't understand what he meant until months later, standing in that garage with a folder in my lap and my father's whole unspoken history spread out across a concrete floor. It was my father who asked for help cleaning out the garage, months later in early autumn, and it was such an ordinary request that I almost didn't register how significant it would turn out to be. He said he needed to make space, that Diane's memory had gotten bad enough that stacks of boxes and half-finished projects were becoming a hazard, something she could trip over or get confused by. He didn't call it what it was. He never did, not in so many words. But I understood, driving over that Saturday morning with a stack of empty bins in my trunk, that we were no longer pretending nothing was happening. We were just still choosing not to name it out loud, the two of us, in our own separate but matching ways. There was no investigation in what we did that day. I want to be clear about that because if I told this story wrong, it might sound like I went digging for answers, uncovering some careful cover-up. It wasn't like that. It was just two people going through boxes, the way anyone does when a life needs sorting, and truth kept surfacing anyway, the way it does when you disturb enough dust. We found the old Christmas boxes first, decorations from my childhood, ornaments my mother had made, including, unmistakably, the crooked little angel, its wire hanger bent at an angle that had clearly been bent on purpose decades ago by someone who liked it that way and had never said why. I held it for a long moment. My father watched me hold it and didn't say anything, and for the first time I understood that the angel wasn't a symbol I'd assigned it, a stand-in for how things used to be, a totem I'd used to punish Diane for straightening. It was just an ornament, and its crookedness was just an accident nobody had ever bothered to fix, and I had built an entire emotional architecture on top of something that had never meant what I decided it meant. We found photo albums, recipe cards in my mother's handwriting, the same box Diane had once been handed without explanation, and I thought about the cookies at that first Christmas, made from a recipe that had belonged to a woman Diane never met, handed to her by a husband who hadn't thought to say this was hers or you don't have to use these or anything at all, just here, use whatever you want, leaving her to guess at the minefield she was standing in. She'd guessed wrong, and I'd let her think it was a small failure of taste rather than an impossible position nobody had warned her about. We found home videos, most of them still in cases I hadn't seen since childhood, my mother's handwriting on the labels in that particular slanted cursive she'd used for everything, grocery lists and birthday cards alike. I put one in an old camcorder we found in the same box, more out of curiosity than any real plan, and watched 20 seconds of my mother, maybe 30 years old in the footage, laughing at something off camera in a kitchen that no longer existed in that configuration, before I had to stop it and sit very still for a minute. My father didn't ask what was on it. He just waited, the way he'd apparently gotten better at doing, until I was ready to keep going. We found old birthday decorations, deflated and folded flat, a banner that had once said Happy 6th birthday in cheerful block letters, the number scratched out and rewritten by hand for at least 2 subsequent years before finally giving up and being retired to a box. I asked whose it was. My father said it had been mine once a lifetime ago, and that he honestly hadn't remembered they'd kept it until just that moment. There's something about a garage, I think, that no other room in a house has, the way it collects the things people can't bring themselves to throw away and also can't bring themselves to look at. So they just get boxed and shelved and left to accumulate, generation after generation, until someone finally has a reason to open them all at once. And in a box near the back, behind a stack of hospital paperwork I initially assumed was recent Diane's, I thought, records from whatever tests they'd been running, I found a folder with a name on it that wasn't Diane's and wasn't my mother's either. Evan Foster. I didn't recognize the name. I sat back on my heels in that garage, folder in my lap, and called out to my father, who was across the room going through old tools, and asked him who Evan Foster was. He went very still. Diane's son, he said. I didn't know Diane had a son. In 3 years of birthdays and Christmases and hunting trips and slowly accumulating small grievances, I had never once heard his name, never seen a photograph, never had the thought occur to me that Diane's life before my father might contain a child. I asked why nobody had ever told me. Because he died, my father said, before I ever met her, years before. She doesn't talk about it. She couldn't for a long time. I think some days she still can't. He was quiet for a moment, turning a wrench over in his hands without really seeing it. I think that's part of why she loves Liam so much. I don't think you ever noticed how much she loves him. I had noticed. I had simply decided at some point early on that her attentiveness toward my son was performance, the eager, overbright interest I'd clocked at that very first barbecue and never revised my opinion of. It had never once occurred to me that a woman who'd buried her own child might look at a 6-year-old boy the way you'd look at something impossibly precious and impossibly fragile. Not because she was auditioning for a role in our family, but because she'd once had exactly this, a small boy. A small voice, small hands, and lost it. And here it was again, offered to her a second time by a family that mostly couldn't be bothered to notice. I asked my father how Evan had died. He said it had been sudden, an illness nobody caught in time, and that Diane had been raising him alone by then, her first marriage already over. He said she'd told him about it exactly once early in their relationship, in a single flat recitation of facts with no elaboration, and had made it clear without ever saying so directly that the subject was closed. Permanently, the way a door gets closed not because a room is empty but because it's too full to look into safely. My father had honored that. He'd never brought it up again, not even, apparently to me, not out of secrecy, he insisted, but because it had never once seemed like his story to tell. I understood that instinct, even as I resented quietly that it had left me spending 3 years mistaking Diane's grief for a personality flaw. I thought about the moment Liam had told me all those months earlier about being called by a different name and getting a cookie afterward. I hadn't understood it then. I understood it now with a force that nearly took the breath out of me. Diane, standing in some ordinary afternoon, looking at my son and seeing, for one unguarded second, a boy who no longer existed anywhere except in her memory. And instead of falling apart in front of a 6-year-old, doing what she'd apparently trained herself to do for years. Apologizing, smiling, offering a cookie, and carrying on as though nothing at all had cracked open inside her. I sat with that folder for a long time. Then I found the other one, my mother's journals, in a box I hadn't known my father kept. I asked before I opened them, and he nodded slowly like he'd been waiting for someone to ask permission to see something he'd never had the courage to show anyone himself. My mother had struggled with depression for years. Not the ordinary sadness of a hard week or a hard season, but something sustained, something she'd apparently tried in her private and careful handwriting to describe and manage and hide all at once for most of my childhood. My father hadn't caused it. Nothing in those pages suggested cruelty or neglect on his part. What the pages suggested, gently but unmistakably, was that he had stopped noticing it, that somewhere in the ordinary business of working and parenting and paying a mortgage, he had let her sadness become part of the furniture, a fact of the household he no longer thought to ask about. And by the time anyone was asking, it was too late to ask in a way that mattered. That was his guilt. Not that he'd failed her dramatically in some single unforgivable moment, but that he'd failed her the way most people fail the ones they love most, through inattention, through the slow accumulation of not quite noticing, day after day, until the distance between them was too wide to see across. The last thing I found at the very bottom of that box was an envelope with my father's handwriting on it, sealed, addressed to no one. I asked him if I should open it. He said yes, though his face had gone the color of the concrete floor beneath us. Inside was a single page, undated, that read, "If you're reading this, I finally ran out of courage." He told me quietly that he'd written it during the worst months after my mother's death, when the guilt had gotten loud enough that he genuinely hadn't known if he'd survive it. He'd never sent it. He'd never shown it to anyone. He'd simply written it, sealed it, and put it in a box, the same way he'd packaged and buried nearly every hard feeling he'd ever had, and forgotten it was there until his own daughter found it while helping him tidy a garage. I understood, sitting on that concrete floor surrounded by the physical debris of two women's entire lives, that I had spent 3 years constructing a villain out of a grieving, frightened, sick woman, while the actual quiet catastrophe in our family had been my father's inability to say a true sentence about anything that scared him, and that his silence had cost my mother her chance to be truly seen while she was drowning, and had very nearly cost Diane the same thing. And had cost me 3 years I would never get back with a woman who had never once been my enemy. I read everything, all of it, the journals, the folder about Evan, letters I found afterward that filled in pieces I still didn't understand. I read it the way my father had asked me to months before, standing at the tailgate of his truck with a sentence I hadn't understood at the time. "Promise me you'll read everything before deciding who failed who." I understood it now. He hadn't been protecting Diane, specifically, or defending himself, specifically. He'd been asking me to withhold judgment long enough to see the whole shape of what had happened to this family, because judgment, delivered too early, is just another word for refusing to look. There were no villains in what I found. That was the hardest part to accept, harder than any single fact. I had wanted for 3 years a clean story, a woman who didn't belong, a father who'd moved on too fast, a family that had been fine until someone new arrived and broke it. The truth was messier and sadder than that. Diane was sick, in a way none of us had caught early enough to matter, and her strange behavior in those middle years hadn't been personality flaws, they'd been symptoms, and I had spent that time collecting them as evidence against her character instead of asking a single question about her health. My father had been carrying a grief so unprocessed it had calcified into a permanent fear of ever looking closely at anyone again, which was its own kind of failure, quieter than cruelty but not less costly. My mother had suffered in silence for years, because silence was what our family did with hard things, a habit I had apparently inherited whole, right down to the sarcastic little comments I made instead of saying what I actually meant. I had spent years trying to prove that Diane didn't belong in this family. It took me finding her son's name in a box in a garage to understand that Diane had spent those same years trying to prove that she did, showing up to barbecues in dresses that tried too hard, buying gifts for a boy who never said thank you, laughing a beat too long at jokes because laughter felt safer than silence, straightening a crooked angel because she genuinely thought she was helping, never once told that the crookedness meant something to someone. My father, meanwhile, had spent those same years trying to hold on to both women, the one he'd lost and the one he was terrified of losing the same way, without ever finding the words to tell either of them what he was actually afraid of. He'd tried to keep everyone, and in trying to keep everyone without ever being honest with any of them, he'd lost pieces of all three of us anyway. Nobody wins a story like this. I want to say that plainly, because I think there's a version of this I could tell you where the ending arrives with music swelling and everybody embracing and every wrong finally righted, and that version would be a lie. That's not what happened. What happened was smaller and I think now truer. Months later, Liam had a school music recital, one of those long, slightly chaotic elementary programs where 40 children in matching shirts sing 3 songs, off-key, while parents crane their necks trying to spot their own child in the crowd. I almost didn't clock at first that my father and Diane were there, sitting quietly in the back row, until I saw them from across the gymnasium. Russ in a folding chair too small for him, Diane beside him in a cardigan, her hands folded in her lap, watching the stage with an attention that had nothing performative left in it at all. Halfway through the second song, I saw Diane lean toward my father and whisper something. I was close enough to hear it. "Which one is ours?" My father didn't flinch, didn't correct her, didn't do anything but smile, gently, the kind of smile I don't think I'd ever seen on him before that whole ordeal began. "The one in the blue shirt," he said and pointed, and Diane followed his hand to Liam, off-key and beaming under the gymnasium lights. And she watched the rest of the performance smiling with a pride that was completely genuine, even though, I understood now, she likely didn't fully remember why that particular boy in that particular blue shirt belonged to her at all. She just knew, in whatever way still remained accessible to her, that he did. After the recital, I walked over. There was no dramatic scene, no apology large enough to cover 3 years, and I didn't try to deliver one, and Diane didn't seem to need one. She complimented Liam, singing genuinely, warmly, as if nothing had ever passed between us but warmth, as if there had never been a crooked angel or a kitchen doorway or 3 unopened presents in the bed of a truck. I simply thanked her. That was all. It was enough for that moment because it was true. My father caught my eye over her shoulder while she was still talking about the recital, and there was something in his face I hadn't seen there before, not relief exactly and not peace either, since I don't think a man carrying the kind of guilt he carries ever fully gets to lay it down. It was something quieter than that. Recognition, maybe. The look of a man who had spent 3 decades avoiding the one conversation that might have saved everyone a great deal of pain, and who understood, finally, standing in a school gymnasium that smelled like floor wax and popcorn, that some of that pain had happened anyway, avoidance or not, and that the only thing left to control now was how honestly he met what remained of it. I don't think he'll ever be a man who says his feelings easily. But he doesn't change the subject anymore, not the way he used to. That, from him, is its own kind of transformation. I think about Dr. Holly sometimes, and the question he never actually answered for me, whether knowing a hard thing ruins you or just changes what you're allowed to choose next. I know the answer now, or at least my version of it. It didn't ruin me. It didn't ruin any of us, though it came close more than once, in ways none of us said out loud at the time. What it did was force us, eventually, to stop performing versions of ourselves for each other, the gracious daughter, the peacekeeping father, the eager new wife, and start being, however imperfectly, the actual people underneath those performances. Diane, it turns out, was never trying too hard because she was insecure about her place in our family. She was trying because she had already lost one family entirely without warning and had learned the hard way that you don't get to assume anyone will still be there tomorrow. I wish I'd understood that the first time I watched her laugh a beat too long at one of my father's jokes. I didn't. I understand it now. On the drive home, Cole reached over and took my hand at a red light. "Do you think things are finally better?" he asked. I looked out the window for a long time before I answered. The streetlights were coming on, one after another, down the length of the road my father might have designed himself. For all I knew, he'd built half the roads in that county, quietly, competently, never once telling anyone how much thought went into making sure they didn't wash out. "No," I said finally. "I think I finally stopped waiting for them to become what I wanted." That's the truest thing I can tell you about how this ends. My father is still carrying guilt he will probably never fully put down, for a wife he couldn't save and a wife he's still trying to. Diane is still living with an illness that takes a little more from her every season, in a way that none of us can stop, only witness. I still have scars from those first 3 years, the sarcasm I let myself indulge in, the crying I walked away from, the presents I found in a closet and never once called her to talk about. None of that gets undone. None of it gets to be fixed with a speech in a gymnasium parking lot. But for the first time, all three of us, my father, Diane, and I, stopped fighting the versions of each other that had only ever existed in our own minds. My villain, his impossible standard of protection, her fear of never quite belonging. We let those versions go finally, not because we found some perfect resolution, but because we ran out of the energy it takes to keep believing in a story once you've finally read the whole thing. Love without honesty eventually becomes loneliness. I know that now the way you only know a thing after it's cost you something. I think about that first Christmas sometimes, the crooked angel, straightened by a woman who was only ever trying to help, corrected by a girl who was only ever trying to hold on to her mother. I think about how much of it could have been different if any one of us, at any one of 100 small moments, had simply told the truth instead of performing what we thought the truth should look like. I don't get those moments back. None of us do. What I have instead is this: a back row seat at a school recital, a father who finally cries in front of me sometimes, a stepmother who still doesn't always remember my name but always somehow remembers to smile when she sees me walk in. It isn't the ending I would have written 3 years ago, sitting in judgment at that first family barbecue. It's better, it's just quieter than I ever expected forgiveness to be.